Let's talk about the organization of the gray matter and the white matter within the spinal cord. So the gray matter is made up of this H shape. And the H shape has these little pointy structures in it. And the pointy structures are called horns. So we have an anterior gray horn, which is on the anterior part of the gray matter. In some segments, we'll see what's called a lateral gray horn. And then we will have a posterior gray horn. And these different areas will contain nuclei associated with different functions. So the anterior and lateral gray horns will be concerned with motor function. And we will see that we will have neuron cell bodies in the anterior gray horns in the somatic motor nucleus. And we're going to have neuron cell bodies that will send their axons through the ventral root, and these will innervate skeletal muscle. So these will innervate control of somatic body function, skeletal muscle. Then we're going to have our lateral gray horns, which we will see in certain segments of the spinal cord, and these will innervate visceral structures. So we're going to have cell bodies in here that also send their axons through the ventral root, and these will innervate visceral structures such as cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, adipose tissue, glands, and so forth. So we're going to have cell bodies. These are still motor neurons here, but they are going to innervate visceral structures, and their axons will pass through the ventral root. Now, when we look at the posterior part of the gray matter, we'll see that we have two nuclei associated with sensation. So we have one that is associated here, this violet one that's in the anterior part of the posterior gray horn with visceral sensation. And the one behind it, located in the posterior part of the posterior gray horn, will be associated with somatic sensation. Both of these nuclei will be receiving information from neurons that will travel through the dorsal root, and these are pseudo-unipolar neurons whose neuron cell bodies will be in the dorsal root ganglion, and these neurons will synapse on cell bodies within these two nuclei. Now, the anterior nuclei, I should say this is still in the posterior gray horn, but the cell bodies in the anterior part of the posterior gray horn are in this visceral sensory nucleus. So they're going to be receiving information from organs, the stomach, the heart, the lungs, these kinds of things, bladder. So these are going to be receiving information about what's going on in the viscera. The somatic sensory nucleus is going to be receiving information about what's going on the surface of your body, as well as joints and muscles. So this is going to receive things like touch, temperature, pain, vibration, and proprioception. And proprioception is where our body parts are in space, so where our arms, limbs are in space, and so forth, where our head is, this kind of thing. And that's what's going to be received here in that posterior part. Now, we also have some white matter tracts that are traveling up and down the spinal cord, and we can arrange them into columns. So we have an anterior white column that's going to be between the two anterior gray horns and also between the two ventral roots. We're going to have a lateral white column that's going to be between the ventral and dorsal root. And then we're going to have a posterior white column that's going to be between the two dorsal roots. Now let's look at a micrograph of this. This is a regular light micrograph, and we can actually see in the gray matter here, we can see neuron cell bodies. These little flecks here are neuron cell bodies, the dark flecks. We can also see the central canal. We can see the anterior gray commissure. That's going to be connecting the two halves of our gray matter across this midline structure here. So we have an anterior gray commissure that passes just in front of the central canal. We're also going to have a posterior gray commissure that passes just behind it. We will also have an anterior white commissure which passes just posterior to the anterior median fissure, this large groove here, and just in front of the anterior gray commissure. So our anterior white commissure would be right here. And if you remember from before, a commissure is a crossing over, like a bridge. So it's like a band of tissue that links two hemispheres. And in this case, we're linking the two sides of the spinal cord. So we can also see our posterior median sulcus here, which is not as large as the anterior median fissure. It's not as wide. We can see our dorsal root here. We can see our ventral root. And here's our dorsal root ganglion. And what's happened here is they sort of wrapped the roots around the spinal cord so they could fit everything onto the slide. Typically, in an organism, the dorsal root and the dorsal root ganglion would be out here somewhere. But to prepare the slide, they just wrapped it around the spinal cord. So here we have, once again, our gray matter, our anterior gray horn, and we've got our posterior gray horn here. There's a little bit of the meninges you can see. You can see some of the pia mater here that has become a little bit delaminated. In life, it would typically be stuck to the actual tissue here. There would not be a space here. And we can look at the other side. We can see similar things. Here we have posterior gray horn. There's a bit of a lateral gray horn here, an anterior gray horn, and these dark flecks are the neuron cell bodies. And once again, you can see the ventral root, the dorsal root, and the dorsal root ganglion here. So as a quick recap, the central canal is surrounded by our gray matter, which contains our sensory and motor nuclei. The gray matter will be surrounded by our white matter, which is going to contain ascending and descending bands of axons, tracts of axons that will be organized into columns, and these axon bundles will have a specific function. And we'll study some of these a little bit later on. We'll also find that the spinal cord is extremely highly organized. And a little bit later on in the chapter, we'll see an interesting picture that's a map. It's a map of what part of the spinal cord or what segment of the spinal cord is associated with which part of the body. So that if you have an injury to a particular part of the spinal cord, you'll actually have some kind of either sensory or motor deficit in the related area of the body. And we'll see that a little bit later on. So when we look at the spinal nerves that come off the spinal cord, we will see that each spinal segment, as we know, has spinal nerves associated with it. And there are 31 segments and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And we're going to have connective tissue around the spinal nerves. And the arrangement of this connective tissue is very similar to what we saw in muscle. And these spinal nerves are going to be basically bundles of axons, and the bundles are fasciculi, and they're arranged into larger nerves. And we're going to see that the connective tissue structures are going to be able to provide a passageway for things like blood vessels and so forth. So let's talk about the three layers. We've seen a similar term before. We have the outer layer called the epineurium. And this is very similar to the epimysium. This is going to cover the entire nerve. So the entire nerve. And it's going to have this dense network of collagen fibers, which is going to form the epineurium. And then we're going to have individual axons that will be grouped together into bundles called fascicles. Just like we saw individual muscle cells grouped into fascicles, that we're going to see the same thing with axons. And these will be covered by a perineurium, and that's the middle layer of our connective tissue, and our innermost layer of the connective tissue will surround individual axons. And as you recall, at this point, we're in the peripheral nervous system, and most of these are myelinated axons, so they're going to have a myelin sheath, and the myelin sheath will be provided by Schwann cells. And you probably remember that the Schwann cell is a type of glia that will myelinate a single segment of a single axon. So let's look from the outside in. Here is our epineurium, and that's going to cover the peripheral nerve. And then we're going to have these fascicles, which are bundles of axons. And then we have the individual axons here. The fascicles are covered by a perineurium. And then we have an endoneurium that covers the individual axons. Well, actually covers the myelinated part of the individual axon. So it will cover the axon with its myelin sheath. So this is the endoneurium. Now here's an electron micrograph. We can see individual axons in here. We can see some coverings here. These are mostly myelinated axons. This is actually a pretty small segment here. So I think we're looking probably at a fascicle with individual axons. It says perineurium around one fascicle here. So here we have two axons that are bound together. And here I guess would be a perineurium. And the endoneurium is going to cover the axon itself. All right, so we also see blood vessels throughout here, which is what we would expect. We would see blood vessels that will be coursing through these connective tissue layers. All right, so the peripheral nerves are basically going to be spinal nerves. These are going to be branches of the spinal nerves. The spinal nerves, once they have exited the vertebral column, they are now part of the peripheral nervous system. So the spinal nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system. They come off the spinal cord and they're going to come out through those intervertebral foramina. They're surrounded by this connective tissue sheath, and these are now considered part of the peripheral nervous system. And peripheral nerves are just anything on the periphery, including the spinal nerves, which we'll find will interconnect into all kinds of branches. They'll form what are called plexuses or plexi, and then we'll have individual nerves coming off of these plexi that will supply a particular part of the body. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But what we're going to find is that the spinal nerves are going to form where the dorsal and ventral roots unite, and they're going to come out of those intervertebral foramina, and they will come together and then they'll branch. So we'll talk a little bit about that structure and how they do that a little bit later on. All right, so let's look at the individual segments and how spinal nerve is formed. So let's pass all of this and get to the actual picture. So here we have, and we're going to focus on first motor stuff. So we're going to focus on the somatic and visceral motor nuclei. Now both of these are going to have their axons leave through the ventral root, where they will then join the spinal nerve. We will see that the spinal nerve will have several branches coming off of it. It will have this group of branches called the rami communicantes, and then it will have a ramus that is a ventral ramus, and this is going to supply the ventrolateral body surface, the walls and the limbs of the ventrolateral surface, and we're going to have a dorsal ramus, which not surprisingly is going to innervate structures of the back. And once these axons join the spinal nerve, now we have things traveling in both directions now. So we have motor information, which is basically going to arise from these two nuclei. Our somatic motor neurons here are going to have their axons. These are red ones. These will innervate skeletal muscle. So these will innervate skeletal muscle of the body wall and limbs and the dorsum, the back as well. We will have visceral motor function, and this is a little bit different. So once it leaves the spinal, or I should say the ventral root to join the spinal nerve, typically it will first enter into one of these rami communicantes, and it will enter into this white ramus communicans. And this white ramus communicans is so called because it's going to have myelinated axons. Most of these axons arising from the visceral motor nuclei are going to be myelinated, and so this is going to appear white. Now, a lot of these axons will either synapse on a cell located in a sympathetic ganglion, or that axon will continue on to other ganglia which are located farther away. And of course, ganglia are collections of cell bodies within the peripheral nervous system. And so we're going to have what we call a preganglionic fiber. And that is an axon from one of these visceral motor neurons that will synapse on a cell body within a ganglion. So here we have a preganglionic fiber, and it says right here, so this first branch of the white ramus communicans contains preganglionic axons. Now, you'll notice what happens next is here we have a preganglionic fiber synapsing on one of these ganglionic neuron cell bodies, and from there we'll have some axons arise, and these are typically unmyelinated, and these will also go to structures, visceral structures such as smooth muscle and these kinds of things. These will be in the thoracic cavity. We'll see that in a little bit. But look at this. Some of these axons will go through what's called a gray ramus communicans. And this is where these axons will join the spinal nerve. And they will innervate visceral structures that are in the back and in the body wall. So these are still innervating visceral structures. If it leaves this part, this is actually called a sympathetic nerve. And we'll study the sympathetic nervous system a little bit later when we get to the autonomic nervous system. But for right now, just know that we have this these rami communicans that are going to come off of the spinal nerve, as well as a ventral ramus and a dorsal ramus. The ventral ramus is going to supply the ventrolateral surface of the body, and the dorsal ramus, the dorsal surface of the body, and the rami communicans will be associated with viscera, with things in the abdominal cavity. So we will see, and in the thoracic cavity as well. So we're going to see viscera of the abdominopelvic cavity, viscera of the thoracic cavity. They will be innervated by these sympathetic nerves. Now, I'd like to point out a mistake on this slide, because the gray ramus communicans is basically containing postganglionic fibers, that is, axons that are arising from cell bodies that are in the ganglion, so it's postganglionic. These fibers are typically unmyelinated, and so this is why it's called the gray ramus, because it doesn't appear white. And it says preganglionic fibers here, that should be postganglionic. Now, so far we've only considered the motor functions. Now let's look at some of the sensory functions. Again, remember that once the ventral and dorsal root join together to form the spinal nerve is mixed. That means it's containing information going in both directions. So not only do we have motor information that left the spinal cord traveling via these spinal nerves and peripheral nerves, but we're going to have sensory information also coming into the cord via these spinal nerves. So we're going to have, basically, once again, we have our dorsal ramus that's going to be bringing information from the dorsum, or the back surface of the body. We're going to be receiving both somatic information that's going to be coming either from what are called exteroreceptors, which are receptors in and around the skin, or proprioceptors, which are monitoring the position of our muscles and joints. And so these are what we would consider somatic sensation. So the red neurons will be bringing that information in, and remember, these are pseudo-unipolar neurons with their cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion, and they'll synapse in our somatic sensory nucleus back here. And then we're going to have also information from the ventral ramus as well, also being brought into the somatic sensory nuclei. And again, it's the same thing, exteroreceptors and proprioceptors. But we're also going to be receiving visceral information, so interoreceptors, things that are located within organs and the like. And these things will be bringing information from basically the interoreceptors of the back coming via the dorsal ramus, and the ventral ramus will be bringing information from the anterior surface of the body. There again, these are going to be synapsing, since this is visceral information, in that visceral sensory nucleus, which is in the anterior part of the posterior gray horn. We are also going to be receiving some information from viscera through these sympathetic nerves. So this is going to be receiving information from visceral organs in the abdominopelvic cavities and in the thoracic cavities. Now, earlier in the lecture, we alluded to the fact that spinal nerves, pairs of spinal nerves, monitor a very specific part of the body. And this areas that they monitor can be turned into a map. And we call this map the dermatome. So that, for example, if we have a spinal nerve, for example, C4, we can look at this map and see what part of the body will be innervated by C4. So we see in this case, this is posterior and this is anterior. We see part of the shoulder here and part of the anterior, the clavicles, and part of the sternocleidomastoid areas. Things in this area will all be innervated by C4. So C4 will be receiving sensory information from these structures and also innervating motor structures here. So, for example, it's not uncommon to see people who come into the clinic with what we call radicular pain. And radicular pain is pain that radiates down a limb. So you could have a radicular pain in the arm or a radicular pain in the leg. And a lot of times you can even have radicular pain that goes through some of these thoracic nerves, but it's usually a bit rare. So, for example, typically what we'll see is if, for example, you have damage to one of these spinal nerves, it will either cause a loss of sensation in the corresponding part of the body, or potentially a loss of motor function, or potentially both. So one common thing you see in the clinic is people who have impinged some of the sacral nerves and some of the the lumbar nerves. And what will happen is they're actually getting smushed as they're exiting the intervertebral foramina, or in the case of the sacrum, the sacral foramina. And something is impinging upon them or pressing on them, like a herniated disc or something like that. And that is causing sensation in the dorsal root, and it can cause pain. It can cause shooting pain, shooting sensations, because we're actually sort of crushing the nerve. And in some cases, for example, if you have the intervertebral discs, which are those fibrocartilage pads between the vertebrae, sometimes those will get smushed and they'll actually herniate. And inside we have hyaluronic acid, and the hyaluronic acid will sometimes squirt out and get on these nerve roots and can cause a great deal of pain around the associated nerves. So this is why a dermatome is important, because it can help us know, for example, what neurons are affected. And I can give an example of my own experience. Several years ago, I had an infection that got in my neck, and I actually had radicular pain down the arm, and it affected C6, C7, and it affected part of C5 as well. And so I was actually having some pain through this area, and it also even affected C8. And so when I went to the doctor, I was able to say, yeah, I've got radicular pain in the arm, and these nerves are affected. And so immediately we knew which spinal segments were affected. And fortunately, the infection went away and everything was normal again. But once again, the dermatome can help you identify where you might be having some kind of pathology in these spinal nerves and which spinal nerves might be affected. All right, so neuropathy is where we have a pathology, and this is where we have a regional loss of function, and that can be either sensory or motor or both. Some people who have sciatica, and I'm sure a lot of people have, I've had it, usually it resolves in most people with time, and it's usually due to one of those intervertebral discs that bulges. But what will happen is a lot of times people will either lose sensation, part of their leg will become numb. You'll feel this painful sensation. Sometimes you'll feel a shooting pain or electrical pain down the leg. And if the situation is allowed to progress further and those nerve roots are being crushed, then eventually you'll start to lose motor function as well. And it's not uncommon for people with sciatic nerve problems to start dropping a foot. That is because they're not innervating it properly with motor stimuli. Then the foot will start to drag. And this is usually an indicator that the nerve is being crushed either by pressure, because the intervertebral disc is either impinging that nerve root there, or there's some sort of physical damage that's preventing that nerve from doing its job. You may have also heard of something called shingles, and shingles is caused by a varicella zoster virus, and that will get into the sensory roots of some of these spinal nerves, and what will happen then is the affected dermatome will break out all along the region of the affected nerves.